I think we're good and we're live. Uh, we'll do it live, like that one video me said. But what's up, everybody? Welcome back to another fantastic day of web-based programming. Um, Today we're going to be building an application that is using React state and props more to demonstrate in a real case scenario how those two parts of using React work. So let's take a look at what we're going to build and talk about how we'll start building it ourselves. So here you can see the skeleton scaffold of a little application that I like to call Favelinks. I built this app a couple of years ago, but I find that the topics are, it's a super simple app that does a lot to help us kind of understand the core concepts of like state and props. The app is pretty simple. We're going to build a couple components. One component is going to be a table of particularly like links that we're going to add using a form on the bottom. People will enter, and I think I have a little GIF of this, right? People will enter a link in the bottom, and the link, as soon as they press submit, will go into the table. So as you can imagine, folks will be able to add as many links as they want to this particular table. And then over time, right, let's say you want to delete a link, you should be able to also go ahead and delete a link. And this is also showing that those links should allow for somebody to navigate to, particularly to that particular part of the, whatever that link is, they should be able to navigate to it. And then folks should be able to delete and remove the link themselves. So we'll try our best to get through all of it. Like I said, I'm going to keep the pace kind of slower than normal so that folks can code along with me since we're doing this live. And yeah, let's talk a little bit about how we'll build this out, just some thoughts on how it's structured, and go into code mode. So thinking about like this application, if you look at the GIF a little bit deeper, right? What components might we need to create in order to do this, right? Like, I think it's always helpful when you see these types of sites and you're like, oh, I'm about to build this in React, ask yourself, like, well, what are the types of components that I might end up building to build this, right? I know that this GIF kind of might be a little harder to see, so let's look at the static version. In the static version, right, we can see that there's a couple big components maybe that we might need. Clearly, we need something to represent that table of all the links. We're going to need something to be like that form. And we're gonna maybe need like some kind of overarching component that's gonna hold the table, the form, and the little bits of text we have up here. My favorite links, add a new URL, etc. Right. So here are a little bit of that component hierarchy built out in a little more particular language, right? So we might need, of course, our app component, something that our application can render and put on the screen. A link container, right? Maybe a component that's just going to hold both our form and the link table itself. And then the form, like a component that just is going to represent the form, and then a table for holding all of the data that we need in the particular component. So let's get it popping and start the process of making this project out. To do it, we're going to use Vite to make the project, to build our React project out from scratch. So to do this, and if you're going to follow along with me, the first thing we need to do is create a new Vite application. So to do that, I'm going to go ahead and open a new terminal window, and we're going to start the process of coding following that terminal. So y'all can follow along with me. If you already launched the Vite app, that's dope. Just raise your hand so I know that you got that done, and we can keep it popping. But if you didn't do it, just follow along with me. We're going to do it real quick. So first thing you want to do in order to create a new Vite app, right? And this is my workflow. You might have a slightly different one for yourself, but I like to open a terminal. So do that and then share my screen for y'all to take a look. Sorry, man, things are lagging just a little bit. All right, cool. So I got this new terminal window open. To launch a new Vite app is fairly simple, right? The command is npm create Vite at latest, And this will allow us, this one command will allow us to create a new Vite application. What you want to be mindful of is wherever you run this command is where you're going to basically create that project folder. So make sure you are in a place where you want that folder to be created. One way you can do this is open your terminal and then use command line tools to navigate to particular folders that you have, right? So in my case, I have a projects folder in my root directory. Another way you can do this is open a folder in VS Code or something and then use a terminal there. So you know, hey, I'm doing this in a folder that I already have. But either way, just make sure that wherever you're going to run this command, you are in a folder that you feel like, hey, this is a good place for this particular thing. So I'm going to go ahead, run this command, npm create vite at latest. And what it's going to do is it's going to start a command line interface for launching a new project. I'm going to call this project Favlinks, and you could call it whatever you want, but we're going to call it Favlinks. And this project, if you press enter, you can select what framework we're going to use. So for us, we're going to be using just regular React today. So I'm going to go to React, and then we're going to be using JavaScript. So just go to that. And boom, we have a new project scaffolded in that particular folder. So here's the step that you got to do. The next 3 steps are put here. So first you want to go into that folder that just got created. So go ahead and change into that directory. The next thing you want to do is install that particular project's dependencies. So we're going to go ahead and run an npm install. And once that finishes, we'll go ahead and run npm run dev to get a server running with the particular project. So just to make things easier, I'm going to do this for myself and get it popping. So your npm install might take a couple seconds, it might take a couple minutes, depending on things on your computer. But once that particular install series finishes, all you want to do next is run the npm run dev command, and you should be good to go. What you will be looking at is the Vite project builder kind of default component. And yeah, if you got to that point and you're just on standby, go ahead and raise your hand so I know that you're right there, and keep it popping once we finish this install and run the dev. Nice. Dope. All right, look at y'all. You know what I'm saying? Okay, y'all CPU bandwidth on 100. That's what's up. I love to see that. Cool. So for those of y'all following along, just make sure you create the new project, install all of your packages, and run the dev so you can have that developer server launched. All right, fam. So now that the install is done, what I want to do is npm run dev, which is going to run a developer server for me. 2 things are going to happen for me. One thing is that it's going to go ahead and launch a new server at a particular address for me. For me, it's localhost 5174. For you, it might be 5173. I think for me, it's at 5174, probably because I have something running on a different port. So what I want to be able to do is go to this URL in the browser to just confirm that I have that running. And so let me just go ahead and do that. And we will be good to go, my friends. Let's see. All right, bet. So let me just reshare my screen. And keep So if you see something like this, you're in a good place. This is exactly what you want to see first, is just the default kind of Vite and React component template. This is just kind of the default. So if you're seeing this, you're good, and you're good to go. If you're having any trouble and you want some support, just drop it in the chat what's going on, and so that any of us can come and kind of help you out as we're working through this. Groovy. Thank y'all to the folks raising your hands. If anybody else finished it up and you're seeing this, just raise your hand real quick, just so I know y'all are somewhat near the same place. Cool, cool, dope, amazing. Look at y'all. Look at y'all, good people. All right. All right. Well, like I said, thank you for those folks dropping some thumbs up, liking, and raising your hand. Cool. If you're having trouble, feel free to drop it in the chat. And like I said, you can stick around a little bit after this, and I'll help you troubleshoot. For now, we'll keep going to the next step, right? So again, to take a look at what we're building, we want to build a version of a component series that is going to allow for us to build this application, right? So we're going to need a couple of different components to do this. And I think the best first step is to start building out those components. So we're going to be spending the majority of the time kind of going back and forth between our live application and VS Code. So what you want to do is open the project that you just installed in VS Code. So you just created a new folder. Well, when you use the Vite command, you created a new folder. So what you want to do is open that folder in VS Code. For me, one way that I can do this is inside of the terminal. I can go back to that same project directory that I have and use and open that particular project folder in VS Code. So let me show y'all how I would do this. So the way I would do this is there's a couple of different ways, right? So this folder that I created and I ran npm run dev on, right, has a particular path. One cool thing to know is you can open the same terminal window in a different tab. So I'll just use terminal. I'll just use the new tab, Command T or Control T to open a new tab. And I'm in the same directory here. I can see where the path is to that directory by using the command pwd. And so this represents the particular path of where my new Vite project is. So one thing I could do is go to VS Code and open a new folder that is at this path. So I can say, oh, open a new folder that's at users, Camino projects, page links, or whatever. So long as you're opening the project folder that you just installed, you're good. Another way that I do is use the VS Code command line tool to open a folder in VS Code just using the command line. So I'll show you how you can install the code command into your path so that you can also just in your terminal run the command like this, code space dot, to open up this particular folder in VS Code. So this command will go ahead and open up a new VS Code window with that particular folder open. Pardon the little delay because of the amount of things going on my computer right now, but y'all get the vibes. Y'all get the vibes. So yeah, I love using the code command just to open my projects in VS Code very easily. That way I know I'm opening the right folder. As y'all see, it's loading. And so the project should kind of open up in a quick second. But if you want to install that code command, it's very simple. You just want to, at the top of VS Code, you want to open up the command palette. So you can go to View and then Command Palette. And when the command palette opens up in your VS Code window, you can type in install, and you should see a command that says shell command install code command to path. And that command, if you click it and press enter, it will run the necessary scripts to to basically install that command into your machine's operating system. That way you can use the code command and in your terminal to open up your VS Code projects in the future. So yeah, quick little hack for y'all on that tip. What you just saw is my typical process for opening my projects up. I'll use the terminal first, navigate to the place I want to save or run my command line, React Builder tool, run that, and then use the code command to open up that folder in VS Code straight into the folder. So if you have an opening up to VS Code on your machine and you can see the files that I'm seeing here on the left, just raise your hand. It's better to see your hand raised because it won't go away. That way I know that y'all are looking at the same thing that I'm looking at. Essentially, all you have to do is open your folder in VS Code, right? Another way you could do that is just go File, Open Folder, and then find the folder that you just used the V command line tool for installing. For me, it's right here in my projects folder. For you, it might be somewhere else. Dope. Seeing good amount of hands. If anybody, like I said, is experiencing some trouble, feel free to drop it in the chat. If you just need a couple more seconds and don't want to rush, you can just give me a thumbs up, and I know that you're working. All right, cool. I'll give a couple seconds for folks to finish up. All right, fam. Cool. If you're ready to rock, keep your hand raised. That's just helpful to know and gauge how many folks are ready to go. If you're still working and need a little more time, just give me a thumbs up and we'll keep it rocking. Okay, folks. See a good amount of folks there. Dope. All right, awesome. So let's keep it going and getting our project together. So basically, fam, we're going to be building a pretty simple React application out from scratch. That application is going to consist of a couple components that we're going to use. So first things first, let's talk about how we're going to structure this application in VS Code. So what I'm going to do is inside of VS Code, anything that we change in our source app.jsx is going to reflect a change on our Vite project. So just to show you what I mean here, right? If I were to go ahead and in the app.jsx, just change something. So in my case, I'm going to go ahead and just change some text. So where we see at the bottom here, it's going to show, right? There's this H1 that says Vite and React, right? I'm going to go ahead and that corresponds to this particular heading that we have here. So I'm just going to go ahead and just for the sake of showing you what happens is this app.jsx is what is being rendered from React into our HTML. So anything that we change in the app.jsx is going to inevitably change what we're seeing in our HTML. So I'm going to go ahead and just change the H1 for a quick second just to demonstrate my point and say anything we change is going to change the HTML. And when my computer stops a little lagging a little bit, we're gonna save that change, and you can see clearly that that changed some of what we got going on here. So y'all should get the vibes, right? Like we gotta manipulate this app.js in order to build the application that we really want. So our next step is to do that. So the first thing we're gonna do is we're actually gonna just delete everything that's in here as a start, because we don't really need any of the stuff in here. It's just kind of put here as a default for us. So what I'm gonna do is go ahead, Command A, and literally delete everything. The only thing that I want to have left is I need a new app function. I'm going to create a new function called app, but I'm going to keep it very simple. For right now, I'm just going to return a little div that has this is our new app component, and close the div. And that right there, my friends, will be our new default component. The only thing I need to do to make sure that the app will still load is export that component. So I'll explain what the export is doing in a quick second, but essentially this is what you should change your app.jsx to. So go ahead and do that. What you're gonna see is, okay, we did a little bit of weird looking styling on this particular component. We'll take a look at where that's coming from in a second. But go ahead and change up your app.jsx to what you see here. And we'll kind of remove those stylings that is creating this little kind of issue for us right now in the styling sense. When you're done changing your app component up, just raise your hand so I know that y'all are there, and we'll keep it rocking. All right, I see some folks have done it. Again, once you just change your app.jsx up like this, go ahead and raise your hand so I know we're in the same place, and we'll keep on rocking and building up this little app for ourselves. If you need a little bit more time for whatever reason, just give me a thumbs up so I know that you're on the verge of a breakthrough. You're making it. Cool. All right, groovy. So majority of us are there, so let's keep it popping. So let's talk about what's going on that's creating these really funky looking styles for us, right? With Vite, there's a couple of files that are created for us by default, right? And so the majority of those files are in our source directory inside of this project folder. We can see that there's an app.jsx. They gave us like a app.css, but there's also this main.jsx and this index.css, right? When you launch a new project with Vite, you're gonna have to understand that the main.jsx is our main default kind of JavaScript file that runs in connection to the HTML to create our application. So the main.jsx is kind of like our main JavaScript file. That's why they named it main.jsx. This file's responsibility is to render our app component to the screen, really, to put it on the HTML document. It does that using some React libraries that we've talked about before, but essentially, as you can see, we're importing the app component from its particular file, and we're calling it and rendering it here on line 8. The other thing that the main.jsx is doing, if you see on line 4, is it's importing a CSS file called index.css. In React, when you're building a component or a JavaScript file, you can add styles to your components just by importing a CSS file. So right now what's going on is we're importing some kind of default styles from the Vite builder from line 4. So what I'm going to just do is comment it out for now, because I just don't want those styles to just be the reason our site just isn't looking all nice. And once I do that, you can see that they're reloaded with the text at the top. It's a white background, just a little bit easier to see. The app we're building isn't going to be so focused on style for right now. We're going to be focusing more on the components, but I just didn't want those styles to come at odds with what we were going to be looking at. So go ahead and comment that out for yourself. If you want, you can make your own CSS file to style it with things the way that you like, and now you know where to do that. So cool. So once you have those styles commented out, you're in a great place to start building. So what we're going to do is we're going to build out a couple of the components that we need to build this application Favelinks that we've been talking about for a while, right? So to do that, I like to put new components that I'm working on in their own folder for organization's sake. So inside of the source directory, the SRC directory that was created in with the Vite builder, I'm going to right click on that folder and click new folder and create a new folder called components. This is going to be kind of my default folder for any new component that I build. And if that component gets so large or I add navigation or something, I might create a different folder for even larger components that might be pages or something like that. For now, all you need is just a place to store new components that we're writing. So just create a new folder called components. It's important that that folder is inside of the source directory. Otherwise, it won't work the way that you expect it to. But once you have that components folder, we should be good to go. So I'm actually going to close this main.jsx. We're not really going to use that much anymore. We're going to be focusing most of our attention, for now, at least in the next couple of seconds, on the app.jsx. So the app.jsx is our first React component that is being rendered. So the main.jsx is the first JavaScript file that is going to be called. It created a component for us, but you can see in the main.jsx, we really kind of defer onto whatever's inside of the app. So that's why, for the most part, you're going to be working on changing up your app.jsx to add the various components that you need to your particular project. In our case, we want to build a functional little application that is going to have all of those little core components of the Favelinks application. So let me just pull that back up for us so we can take a look at just one more time, like what that's going to look like. So we need essentially to build our little app.jsx to allow for us to do something like this, right? And typically, right, we could just go ahead and start putting all of these different elements onto the app.jsx, but it's better practice in React to think about everything as its own component, right? So one component that we're going to build is just going to be a kind of container for this whole little application that the app.jsx is going to render for us. I'm going to call that component a link container. And realistically, the link container is going to be literally all, like, kind of just like a wrapper over all of this stuff, if you can think about it. So clearly there's a bunch of other things inside of here, but we're going to focus first on building out this little big container as its own component that will hold our project, essentially. The app will be responsible for rendering this component. The container that we'll have later will add all of these other little components inside of it. And as we're building, I'll explain a little bit about why I'm choosing to do it that way. So first, I want to go back to VS Code and go to the app. If you look at it right now, our app is very simple, right? There's not much going on in there. And honestly, I think that's great practice for how components should work, right? I don't think components should have so much information in there that it's hard to understand what the components are doing. If your component gets so big or it's like kind of hard to read, you might want to consider breaking that up into more components. And so by using more components, we can actually keep our files pretty simple. It'll make it a little bit easier to understand. Of course, it'll increase how many files we're using, but it'll keep our code a little bit more readable. And for folks like yourselves who are learning, I think it's helpful to kind of see things broken down into their own components. So let's go ahead and start adding our first component. So we're going to create a new component inside of our components folder. I'm going to create a new file, and I'm going to call it link container, capital L, capital C, .jsx. And this will be the place where I'm going to create a new component for myself. I'm going to call it a link container. Oops, if I can spell it. And the link container, again, every component, every React component that you build has to do at least one thing, which is return some JSX. And again, JSX is just the JavaScript syntax that allows for us to write the HTML visual components, visual elements, excuse me, that we want to put on our screen in these JavaScript files. So for me, I'm going to just start off by just creating a simple div again. And I'm just going to type link container. I like doing this to just kind of make sure my things are rendering correctly. So this is just going to be a simple div with some text inside of it for now, but we're going to have to export it because I want to import it into our app.jsx. So your link container should look a little bit something like this for now, right? Just a little functional component that's returning a div with the link container inside of it, and then export it at the bottom. Once you all are at this stage, just give me a quick hands up so I know that you're right along with me, and we'll keep it popping. Nice. So we created a new file in our components folder called link container.jsx. Created that new component on the right-hand side. You can see it right there. And yeah, once we have this export, we'll be able to call this component into another file. Cool. I see 8 folks are good to go. If you're rocking with me, just raise your hand. And if you need more time, just give me a thumb up. Cool. No problem. Cool. Go ahead and raise your hand when you're done. That was helpful. That is real helpful for your boy Cam. Awesome. Cool. Great. So the majority of folks are there. So we'll keep it popping. So so dope. So now what we want to do is now that we have this link container component, I'll make sure I save it. But now that I have this link container component, right? The component itself is everything from line 1 to line 9. These curly braces and the thing that is being returned. The export line, you need the export line here in order to import a component that you're writing in one file to another file. So what we're going to do now is we're going to import this link container component in our app.jsx. So we're going to do that very simply by going back to the app.jsx file, creating some space at the top, and then I'm just going to say import link container from /component/link container. You'll see that VS Code will try its best to help you out and autocomplete some of this stuff, which is dope. But yeah, this is the path to our file, our components folder, and then we have a link container file inside of it. With that, that will allow us to now use the link container as a component inside of another component, which is our app component. So I'm going to replace what's going on in the app right now where that text is that says this is our new app component with a new component that is just our link container. We're just going to render the link container in the app. So when we're all said and done, our app file should look a little something like this. We should have a new link container component imported at the top, and we'll have a link container added to our, we're going to render that link container right there. So please go ahead and make those quick changes for yourself. And when you look at your, when you go back to looking at the Vite server on localhost 5174, you should just see something that says link container on there. If all of the steps you did worked out the best. So all you have to do, import your link container and then render the link container on in your app. When you got that going, just raise your hand so I know that y'all are here, and we'll keep it going. Most folks are ready to go, so let's keep it popping. So, so now that we have our link container being rendered from the app, we're actually in a great place to start thinking about how is our link container, which is now kind of the main component focus that our project is focusing on. How is our link container going to help us build out this little Favelinks application? So I'm sorry, responded to an issue in the chat. Cool. So our link container is actually going to be the main container for our app. We just use the app because the app is being what the first component being rendered. So now we're basically saying, hey, when we render our new application, the first thing that's going to get rendered is the app component, but the app component is saying, hey, inside of me, all I have to render is a link container. And that's kind of how these components work, right? Is we just define what elements are going to be seen. In our link container, we have right now just a div with link container inside of that. But now this is where things get a little bit more interesting. So let's take another quick look at the particular kind of thing we're building for the Favelinks components. So to do that, what I want to do is just show y'all the README one more time. Probably should just keep it up so it's easy to go back to. That's my bad. All right, here we go. So I'll keep this up so that's easy to switch back and forth to it. So so we want now our link container to essentially allow for us to build out these pretty large components, right? So we see kind of some message at the top. We have a table, it looks like, and we have another message with a form and submit input box, a couple input boxes, and a submit button. So our link container is actually going to be responsible for rendering all of this. But like I'm saying, we don't want the link container to just have to do everything in terms of put all this code in here. So we're going to break this up into multiple components itself. Frankly, we're going to just use two different components. One is just going to be a table component for ourselves to keep our reference of all this stuff going on in the table. And then the second one will be a form component that we'll create to do this little form at the bottom. So let's go ahead and switch back over to VS Code and get that popping. So to do that, inside of our components folder, we're going to create two more files. So one file is going to be called table.jsx, and the second is going to be called form, where is it? Form.jsx. And note that whenever I'm creating a new component, I'm using a capital letter as the starting point for that component because that is by standard how we create components in React. You should always have your components start with a capital letter, just so that it's clear that those are components and not elements or just regular JavaScript files. Both of these components will be relatively straightforward. They're going to be doing slightly different things. So what we're going to do first is just make sure each of these files have a component inside of it. So I'm going to just create a function for each of those components. So since I'm in the form.jsx right now, I'm just going to create a function called form and return, and just we'll talk about what we'll return in a second. And then just export the default form, right? So clearly I just need to fill in this return statement with something. It turns out, right, that in HTML, there is a form element that we can use in order to do this work. So it makes it very simple to, HTML will make it very simple for us to use a form, right? Because there is an entire set of HTML elements for forms. So I'm just going to go ahead and just show you what I mean by going to the W3 schools. I just typed in HTML form W3 schools. Again, the W3 schools is just a great resource for seeing, learning about HTML, CSS, and JavaScript. But there is a set of HTML elements that allow for us to create forms. So here's an example, right? So this is kind of similar to what we want to build. This is a little HTML form, right? And the HTML form is comprised of a set of different elements. So the first element is a form element, which is a container element for wrapping all of your form elements. The form element allows for you to kind of hold those elements, and it itself has certain attributes and that you can use to respond to changes in your form elements. Another set of elements that you want to be familiar with, and these are HTML elements, by the way, right, is the input element. The input element is an HTML element that allows for you to display form elements, right? Some could be like a text input, radio button, checkboxes. You could use the submit input type to create a button, right? You can also just use a regular button, right? The difference between the submit and the button is when you click a submit input, it will trigger the form being submitted, versus if you just have a regular button, you will have to define what that button does. Point is, there's a number of different elements for HTML forms that will allow for us to create the form that we want. The reason why is because inside of the way that JSX works is it allows for us to define all of these HTML elements in our JavaScript components. So anything that can be created in HTML can be created in React JSX. So we're going to be building something slightly similar to what we're seeing here, and just using the form input, the form elements that we see around here to help us make that possible. So I'm going to go back to my form, and for now, I'm going to just return just a super simple form. I'm not going to put any of the elements in there yet. We'll do that in a second. But first, I'll do this, and I know that in our kind of project folder thing, we see that this form is going to eventually have an input and a submit button. So we can add those in a quick second. So I'm going to pause here and just make sure that we kind of create our form component. So go ahead and make these quick changes so you have a form component ready to go. And when you're done with that, just go ahead and raise your hand so that I know that we're in the same place. Awesome, fam. So I see the majority of us got our form component up and running. So the next component that we're going to want to build out is our table component. And so I just want to do a similar process to just show you kind of how we'll do that by going back to the W3 schools and just showing you HTML tables also. So if you take a look on the left-hand side in the W3 schools tutorial, you can see all the different types of HTML that you can create. And it does a good job of explaining some of the more important HTML elements for you. Forms are in there. They have their whole own section, but tables are also in here. If you scroll up a little bit, we see HTML tables. So HTML tables essentially are an HTML element that allow for us to create a table, right? And a table is essentially a header and a series of columns and rows that correlate to the data from those headers. You can define an HTML table using some simple HTML. There is also a table element that is essentially just like a form. It's a wrapping element. It's a container element for all of our data for our tables. Table data can be represented in a couple of different ways. You can have a row for your header, for all your headers inside of the table. You can have then rows for the data that represent each column in the particular headers. And then you can have as many rows of data as you want. So as you can see, it kind of can get really hard to see what's going on with the table if you're just leveraging just regular HTML and building out everything in HTML. The good news is that JavaScript will make it easier for us to see what's going on and make our tables dynamic, which is the point of what we're working on. Tables are comprised of cells, and a cell is just a table row with certain data. So we're going to use all of these different aspects of tables to create the tables that we want. And so what we're going to do is go back to VS Code. Now that we kind of have a default version of our form, let's make sure we get a default version of our table. So we can at least have that ready to go as well. So I'm going to go ahead, create a new function called table inside of my table.jsx. And then I'm going to make sure I export it at the bottom just because I don't want to forget. And all I have to do is return, for now, a super simple little HTML table for myself. And you can see that the form is tables very similar to the form, except we're going to be returning a table instead of a form. So go ahead and knock out creating your first table component. And when you got that done, just raise your hand so I know that you're in the same place. Dope. So I'll give it a couple seconds more. Thank y'all for those of y'all raising your hands. Remember, the table component is literally the same as the form. It's just returning a table instead of a form. Cool. So if you're still working, just give me a thumbs up. Otherwise, we'll keep it pushing. Just making sure my folks is good. Don't want to leave none of y'all behind. Again, if you're having trouble, feel free to drop anything that you're struggling with in the chat. Cool. Awesome. All right, bet. So majority of us are here, so we'll keep it popping. And if you have a question, feel free to drop it in the chat. Awesome. So we have these two new components. And so the way that React works, right, we want to be able to render these components into our application. So what I want to do is I want to go ahead and now that I have these three components, I have a link container component, a table component, and a form component, right? Um, I want now for my link container to import those two new components that we created. Our link container is going to be kind of our master component of, it's going to have, or let's say our main component to hold all of the data and all of these and all of this stuff for our table and our form we'll have inside of our link container. So let's just build out our link container to be a little bit more like a container. And to do that, we're gonna just kind of structure it a little bit more like how our how our application is meant to be. So I'll show y'all that real fast. So we know that inside of our components, we kind of want this nice little header that has like my favorite links, and then there's maybe a little paragraph of text, our table, and then maybe another header, and then our form. So we can go ahead and make our link container out to do this stuff. So let's just go ahead and do that. So first thing we're going to do is add an H1 to the top of our link container. The H1 is going to say um, whatever this thing just said, my favorite links, my favorite links. And then we're going to have a nice little paragraph underneath that says whatever this thing says, add a new URL with a name and link to the table. Add a new URL with a name. Add a new link, I should say, add a new link with a name and URL to the table. Cool. So if I save this right now, because our link container is being rendered on in our Vite app, if I go back to, sorry, no. If I go back to the Vite application that we started, I should see my favorite links, add a new link with a name and URL to the table. So that's great. So changes to our link container, this H1 and this paragraph are being registered. So clearly based on just kind of how this is structured, it looks like we have those header, that paragraph, our table, and then another header maybe, and our form. So we'll go ahead and do that. So essentially what I want to do is I want my table to be rendered inside of here now. So to do that, I'm going to go ahead and at the top of the link container, I want to import both of the components that we just worked on. So I want to say import table from my components dot slash oh, the thing is and VS Code is real helpful for this, right? It showed me that inside of my current, like my link container is inside of the same folder as my form and my table.jsx. So I can refer to them just by saying dot slash table because it's inside of the same folder that I'm in. So I'll do the same thing to get my form from dot slash form. And now I have both of those components ready to go. So I can keep building out my link container to say, okay, cool, render the table, right? That's the first thing. And then it looked like I had another head H1 that said, add a new, whatever it said, add a new, oh, it just says add new, my bad. So add new, and underneath this, we'll render our form. So a couple big changes. We imported the table and the form, and then we changed up our link container a bit to render our H1's little message with a paragraph, our table, render another H1 with the form. So with all those changes being done, your drawing at the end should look a little something like this. And if you're there and you see something like this, just raise your hand. I'll go back to the link container where we did the majority of our changes. And this is what your code should look like when you're done with all your changes. Thanks. Feel free to raise your hand once you've got those changes up, and we'll keep pushing forward. A couple more stuff we got to do. Thanks to y'all raising your hands. Appreciate that. Let's go ahead and swap over your link container. If you got to the first steps that with your link in your form, with your form in your table, just making these changes that you see in your link container should work. If you're still hacking, you see a couple more seconds, just give me a thumbs up. Otherwise, raise your hand or just sit and observe, sit and observe. Cool. Awesome. So majority of folks are here. So we'll keep it pushing. If you have a question, feel free to drop it in the chat or stick around. And again, I'll help you troubleshoot. But for now, right, we kind of have the basis of our little application. We have that header, the paragraph, that other header. The only thing is that we're not really seeing a table, and we're not really seeing our form. So now we can go back, and now we know, okay, well, now I want to spend time changing up the components that I just added. My form, which is here, and I know it's here because if I go ahead and inspect the elements on the HTML and take a look at the body, my HTML body, clearly there's a div in here, and I can see all of my elements are here. I have an H1, I have a paragraph, I have a table, my H1, and my form. So everything's there. But because the table's not showing any data, we're not seeing anything. Because the form's not doesn't have any form elements, we're not seeing anything. So now we got to go ahead and edit those elements in those various components. So that's what we'll do next. So now I'm going to just jump back into my VS Code, and with where we are now with the link container, like I'm saying, all of these elements are being rendered appropriately, but the table and the form aren't really showing all of the data that we need them to see. So let's just make sure that we see something in both of those just to know that they exist. So first things first, let's start with the which one? Let's start with the table because it's actually a little bit more work in the table. So table elements are interesting because we need to define a good amount of data for our table. So first thing we need to do is we need to define our table head, and then our table body of data. The table head and the table body should allow for us to have the various columns that our rows of data will conform to. So what I want to do is I want to create our table to have all of those different elements inside of it. And essentially, if we go back to just the W3 Schools example, right, you can see how a table can be structured using, we could just have all of this information in our table. Like matter of fact, I'm just going to go ahead and copy these table rows and data that we see here as an example, and just paste it into mine, just so that y'all can see what's going to happen here, right? So here in this table, we see a first row with a TH element. The TH stands for the table head. And then everything underneath is a table body piece of data, right? So if I go back to our Vite application now, I should see a nice little table kind of being started, at least with some columns and some data. Now, this is just meant to show you what we'll eventually have, and also to make a point. if you look at this right now, right, it's not really the easiest to see. And we have a couple bits of data that kind of might grow over time, right? Our table header is not really clear that this is just a table header. And then here, this is like all the data for the table. So what happens when what happens when we have 1,000 elements in the table, right? Things will get really hard to read really fast if we keep everything just stacked in this component like this. So my recommendation is, what if we break these things up into separate components, right? What if we have like a component just for the table header, and then maybe we have a component for our table body and the data that the table will show in the body. By doing that, right, we can really keep our table header clean. We can keep our table clean by just having two components that will be rendered instead of like 1,000 that will make it hard to read. And maybe we can make our table body a little bit more efficient with how it renders the data. So to do that, what we're going to do is we're just going to go ahead and create some more components. And instead of having these components in their separate file because they're related to our table, I'm just going to actually define these components inside of the same file. So all I'm going to do is just create a couple more components to use. I'm going to create a table header component. And then I'm going to create a table body component like this. The table header component is going to be responsible for, I'm just gonna leave a comment here, responsible for rendering the head of our table with the appropriate comments. And I'm just gonna make this a better comment for myself like this. So here I just wanna return kind of a table head with data. And then similarly, in the table body, this is going to be responsible for rendering the data for our table. And so I'll return something in this particular component as well. The difference will be, right, so now instead of having all of this rendering from our table component itself, I'm going to actually render those subcomponents instead. So I'm going to instead render our table header and our table body as data. And so I can get rid of this little default stuff. And as you can see, this just really simplifies how our table is being structured, right? Clearly, we still need to build out our table header and our table body components to do what they need to do. But hopefully you see what I mean, that now our table is way cleaner. If you agree that it'd be way cleaner to keep it this way than it was before, just give me a thumbs up. That's the point, right? Is we should be building these components out to really simplify how this is being structured so that it's a little bit easier to read. But of course, now we have to structure these other components to allow for that to happen, right? We need our table header to return some data for our table, and we need our body to return some data for our table as well. So to do that, we're going to make use of a couple HTML elements. I'm going to go ahead and just copy them in here, and then we can talk about it, what we're seeing in a second. So for the table header, what we're going to do is we're going to create a table header using the table head element. So there is a table head element. There's a table body element in HTML. So we're just those are container elements for if you're going to separate your head and your body from your table. You could use the table head element to create a table head. So here's how we'll create our table head. It will consist of a row. Remember that each table's header will be a row with different headers for the columns. So these will be our table header columns. Our table body, we'll get to in a second. This will be a place for us to return some table body data that will allow for us to also, create essentially a row of data for ourselves that has those particular elements defined inside of it. So essentially what I mean by elements is that every row of data will need to have at least these three things, or at least one of these three things defined: the name, the URL, or the removal. If they don't, in that row, the row will be empty, right? So we want a row that at least has some of this data in it. So to show you what I mean by this, first thing we're going to do in the table body is we're going to return a T body element. The T body element, just like the T head element, just represents kind of like a container element for the body. And matter of fact, because the table body might be empty to start with, we actually can just keep it, let's just keep it simple for now so that y'all can catch up. We'll just return kind of an open and empty table body. But at least we'll keep our header open with some data here. I'll close this so y'all can see it a little bit better. And all we're going to do is then render our table header and our table body. So go ahead and make these quick changes. If you do, what you'll see is when you look at your main project, you'll see the table header has changed to have the columns that we need, but there's no data inside of it. For now, that's fine. And then we'll fix that in a second. But our table header, right? We're going to just switch our table up to have a table header component and a table body component, which we defined up here. The table header will return this stuff. The table body will just return kind of a simple T body, and that will allow us to return these two components this way. So go ahead and make this last quick change and raise your hand when you got that going. I'll zoom out just a little bit so that y'all can see. All right, y'all. So thanks to y'all raising your hands. So I'm just gonna do a quick recap of a couple things, right? And then I'm gonna add some more changes real fast. And then what I'll do is give y'all a copy of the code so y'all can have the version ready to go up to this point. So our table, right? Our table component, we switched it up a bit. We added two new custom components. So we made a new component called a header and another component called table body. To sneeze, excuse me. Or maybe not. Maybe I told myself not to sneeze. That was really cool. So I have two new components, a table header and a table body. The table header, right, is just going to be a super simple component. We're going to define all of these in the same file because they're all related to one another. The table header and the table body are going to be called inside of the table. So it doesn't really make sense to necessarily have them all in their own file. We don't, and I just want you to know you don't have to do that. The table header is going to use the table head element to return a row of data that has a head for a name, a header for a URL, and a head for a remove button. The table body for now, we'll keep it empty. And that's that within our table. Our link container, right? If we go back a step, our link container is responsible for rendering all of the stuff that we have so far. So our table is being rendered in our link container. If we go back to the table real quick, remember we're exporting just this table component, right? You can export multiple components from one file, but for now, let's just keep it good practice. And you don't need to do it right now. So what we do need though, is we need the finished table to be able to be exported so that we could import it into our link container like we were doing before. And that will allow for our link container to have a full table, our table kind of showing up and the form showing up. The last change I want to do is focus on the form. So let's go ahead and make that quick little change so that we can actually see our form being shown up. So our last bit of changes here are just to set this up for ourselves to work on a little bit more, is we need the form to show a form, right? And the form itself is going to have two elements. It's going to have an input for us to type in, a secondary input for us to type in, and a submit button. And if we actually go back to the HTML W3 schools, we can see that there's a whole example of what that would look like in HTML right here. So to take a look at that, we kind of see the form for HTML is structured like this. Some of this, all of this in terms of the HTML is great. In terms of how we would do this in JavaScript, things are going to be a little bit different though. So what I'm going to do is just copy everything inside, and we'll talk about what we really need from this inside of our actual form .jsx file. So inside of the form.jsx file, I'm just going to paste that stuff that I just copied in there. It started blowing up at me. Oh, the reason why is because of these break tags that weren't closed. So I will get rid of them for now, and we'll talk about what we really need out of this. So let me do this. So, oops. Not bad. Just clean this up a little bit so y'all can see, and I'll zoom back in so y'all can see. So our form element is going to have a couple different form inputs in there. One of the different elements you can use inside of a form is a label that will correspond to a particular, it'll correspond to a particular form input or element that you have. So you can see that there's a label and there's an input element in here. And we just have two labels and inputs, and then we have one input for our submit button. Now, this is fine. The reason that this stuff is blowing up at me is because as you can see, some of these elements don't have closing tags. So in one difference between HTML and JavaScript is that we need to actually close these tags properly. So to do that, I can just actually add like kind of a self-closing tag here to these inputs. And now things should be good in our component. So just to break this down into kind of simple terms, we're going to use a label. In this example, they created a label for first name and of input to take in somebody's first name. For us, we're going to use a label for, let's just say, link name, right? And here, we're going to say the name of the label, we're just going to say, let's just say link name, right? Basically, the for attribute in our label is going to correspond to the input that we're connecting that label to. So I'm going to go ahead and just change this ID and change this name to just be the link name, like so. Value, for now, I'm going to just keep empty. We'll talk about the value in a quick second. Same thing for the label for the last name. I'm going to actually change that to say URL, and I'm going to say link URL. And I'm going to make sure I change the ID to say link URL and the name to say link URL. And again, keep it as a empty value. And the submit button is fine for now. Yeah, the submit button is fine for now. If I save this, right, and go ahead and go back to my application that's running, you'll see that I have everything clearly there, but it's all kind of showing up in the same line. So in order to fix that, one of the things that the W3 schools was doing was using break tags to break up kind of the elements that are here. So you could create a break tag by just using the BR element to create a break. And so it was creating some breaks for our LR labels and our links like so. So let's go ahead and do that. And as you can see, it just put everything on its own line for us. I might add another one just to give it a second, little extra space. But again, I could also do this with some CSS to just make it so that these elements aren't just these elements are showing up appropriately just with some CSS, right? But for now, just kind of do it like this so that I have my link name, link URL, submit button. And now I'm actually in a great place to start actually figuring out how am I going to make it so that now with these two components, right, I can figure out how to adapt these this form to get some of the data to our table. So I'll pause here as this is the first step of getting this project together. I'll pause on the form for a couple minutes for those of y'all who want to copy what I have in the form. If you want to stick around and you have some questions, feel free. What I'm going to do is bundle up this code and give it to y'all in Slack. And what we'll be working on next is the next step, which is taking what we have here and figuring out how can we use what we know about React to take the data that will be passed from the form into our table. And that's where things get exciting with using props and state in order to do that. So thank y'all for your time and attention. I want to stop while we're here at time, but I'll pause for a second on my form for those of y'all who want to stick around to copy that over. For those of y'all who don't want to, feel free to slide. I will talk to y'all soon. But yeah, I'll also stick around if y'all have questions. Feel free to raise your hand.